Hello and welcome to Capitol Review. I'm Tasmin Mahfuz, and this week we start in the Commonwealth, where the Virginia Department of Education released new guidance on the treatment of transgender and non-binary students in schools. Governor Youngkin's model policies have been under review for months now. His office says they've received tens of thousands of public comments. Now, we've got Northern Virginia Bureau reporter Marcilla in the studio tonight. Great to see you. So talk to us about what's changed. There was a lot of pushback last year. What's new now? Admittedly, not much. Much of the document has remained the same despite about 70,000 plus comments from people across Virginia. But tonight, the Youngkin administration is saying this is about parents' rights, and they say that these policies are the right move. We broke down a little bit about what they say. Governor Youngkin and his latest transgender student model policies are back under the spotlight. If adopted, teachers and school staff must only use the name and pronouns on a student's official record unless a parent submits a document showing a legal name or gender change. Also, students must use the bathrooms that correspond with the sex they were assigned at birth, as long as federal law allows. And single-user bathrooms should be made available to everyone with appropriate signage. Plus, no teacher can conceal information about a student's gender from their parent.
These are policies that are certainly needed and go a long ways in making sure we protect fundamental rights for all students and for teachers as well as for parents.
Todd Gackey with the conservative advocacy group Family Foundation of Virginia says this promotes parents' rights, and Governor Youngkin says the policies reaffirm my administration's continued commitment to ensure that every parent is involved in conversations regarding their child's education, upbringing, and care.
It's definitely devastating. For a lot of youth and their families, this is probably the worst news they could have received.
But Candace Tuck, the president of Equality Loudoun, who identifies as transgender, says it's a harmful policy.
And when you don't understand it, you fear it. And when you fear it, you want to make it go away. The reality is these youth are not going anywhere, and all this is doing is hurting children.
So school districts still have to adopt this policy, but notably there's no date by which they have to do so. And if last year was any indication, it could be a struggle in Northern Virginia, where many school boards pushed back strongly on moving further away from protections granted by former Governor Ralph Northam's transgender student policies.
So, Max, you shared what the reaction was once these guidelines came down, but how are school districts feeling? What are you hearing from them?
Well, of course, there's a divide based on where in the Commonwealth you are. In more rural and red-leaning districts, they are excited. If they haven't already adopted proposals similar to 2022's, they're probably going to do so this year. But in Northern Virginia, Alexandria, Arlington, Fairfax, they've all come out and basically said they don't want these policies. They feel what they have on the books, again, aligning with what Governor Northam conducted. They believe that that's the best policy to help protect transgender students, so they don't really want to implement these policies.
And the Youngkin administration is now telling school districts that they have to follow the policies and the law, but we all know, schools are on summer break right now, so what's the deadline that they have?
That's kind of the gray area, right? There's no deadline set in this policy. It doesn't say by this date you have to enforce it. There's also no strong enforcement mechanism. It doesn't say you have to enforce it by this date and it has to include this and that. It's sort of a gray area that school districts are kind of using and saying that we don't need to do these policies, especially if they feel, as some in Northern Virginia do, that the ones they have on the books are the best ones for their student body.
And something that we haven't touched on are student athletes and transgender student athletes. What does the policy say about that?
So another gray area, which kind of gets to the point, there is some confusion about this. There is an element of the policy that Governor Youngkin drafted, that his Department of Education drafted, that says student athletes, they have to play on the teams that match their sex at birth. But the VHSL, which is the leading organization that oversees public and private high school sports in Virginia, they've had a policy for almost a decade now, and they're sticking with it. Essentially, it says, yes, there are some instances where a student identifying as transgender can play on the team that matches their gender identity. That kind of goes counter to what the Youngkin administration is proposing. And proponents of that rule, the VHSL rule, say that that's worked. Again, it's been on the books for almost a decade. There's only been a couple dozen instances where a student has appealed to play on a team that matches their gender identity. And again, advocates and people who support this rule say there's really been no pushback, no big controversy. Of course, Governor Youngkin, though, has repeatedly said he's worried that that could cause some unfair situations if student athletes were to play on a team that matches their gender identity.
And Max, you've been saying it over and over again that things are still kind of up in the air. So for parents and families, what should they know before they head back to school in August?
Well, keep an eye on things. There are people on either side of this issue who say this could get litigated in courts even. This is not a battle that is done. Of course, we've seen some legislation arise and fail in Virginia to kind of codify some of these things. But what you need to know, especially if you're here in Northern Virginia, is a lot of the policies that have been on the books for a while, they are still in place. For instance, in Fairfax County, well, their school policy says if a student or parent tells a school that they identify as transgender, well, the district will make accommodations. Those accommodations could include calling them by the names and pronouns that they wish to be called, that is the student. Bathrooms, they will have the option to use the one that matches their gender identity. Same with locker rooms. And as far as different support, well, it says in the Fairfax County policy that if a student comes forward, identifies as transgender, wants to change their gender identity, the school district will work with them to create a support team. So if the policies are in place, kind of go into August and September in the new school year, expecting that will be the same. But of course, keep an eye on this because these school districts and these school boards will have some tough decisions to make in the coming months.
Yeah, Max, really appreciate you. You've been covering this for the past year. Appreciate your insight and for your time here on Capitol Review. Thank you.
Thanks to this.